Who made it up to 8:45 this morning on Saturday morning. Kia ora, my name is Rich Durham, and I'm going to be doing this little presentation that I put together for you today. Unpacking values, lettering technique for value mapping a serious game design. And if the title with a colon didn't put you off, you were in the right place. All right, so I'm going to start, of course, by telling you a little bit where I'm coming from as a games designer and academic to kind of frame this talk up. So I work at the University of Auckland currently in the Creative Arts and Industries faculty, but largely as a games designer, I've worked across a number of different mediums. So I consider myself a generalist when it comes to game designer. I've worked as creative director, I worked as game designer, worked doing the art for my own games, etc. Museum installations, little hobby board games, serious board games about early Māori Pākehā interactions that were all kind of research-based at the University of Auckland, and mega games to help with students in Vietnam, et cetera, right? So a lot of different mediums, mostly physical, also a number of digital interactive stories that I've made as well. All of this is to say that I'm coming at this from just a general design, play, design, experience design background. So with the very long title, what is this even about? Existential crisis mode time. Why are we even doing this kind of a thing? So for me, it's coming from making a lot of games for serious causes, social good causes, etc., where they have some good intention in mind, and then they have an objective in mind that they want to achieve, and they think, well, if some sort of play experience maybe, or a game experience, just we can make it a little fun, we'll jazz it up and they'll get better outcomes. And oftentimes this leads down a bad path, and whether it's ineffective or you end up with something completely opposite of what they wanted. So to illustrate this, I'm going to tell a pretty common example. So bear with me if you've heard this one before. Otherwise, it's a great example. So in late 19th century, British officials in Delhi were concerned about the growing cobra population. So to address it, of course, they offered a bounty to every dead cobra that was brought into them. And the cobra population began to drop as people began hunting the cobras, but the reality is that the growing cobra population was more complex than the British officials had set up to address it. So they were essentially giving points for this intermediary step, kill the cobras, and not for like a lower cobra population. So as kind of a predictable result, as you might imagine, some enterprising individuals started breeding the cobras to earn more money from the bounty. And when the officials discovered this, they ended the bounty program, and everyone just kind of released the snakes they'd been breeding and ultimately increased the cobra population in Delhi. This is anecdotal, mind you, but it is a rife example in modern day where you end up with these perverse incentives. One way of looking at this is that the officials not only had a poor grasp on how to create a system to address the problem, as the incentives were clearly in the wrong place, but also they had reduced the complexity of how the snake population was growing and why the snakes were biting people to nothing, right? They weren't even concerned with that reality. They just said, snakes, kill snakes. So what I'm getting at is when looking at game design then through these kind of triadic kind of pieces. And there's a number of game design frameworks out there that kind of reduce things to like these threes, and a lot of them kind of coalesce around these kind of three concepts of a games design, which I'm calling the how, the why, the what, the classic kind of breakdown. But in this case, it's the why. What was the meaning behind trying to do their incentive or make their game or the serious game in the first place? In this case, reduce the snake population because maybe people were getting bitten. Sure. Then they said the play model in this case is, well, we'll just make a system and it's going to be, we have snakes, we'll pay people to kill snakes, less snakes, problem solved, right? Very reductionist. And the reality, of course, was completely ignored in this situation. So we're going to look at why these three are important. And leaning on that reality part, which they didn't even bother with, one might say, well, clearly all they needed to do was in a very detailed way, model the actual reality of why snakes are breeding, how snakes are coming about, what's the ecosystem look like, so that we can have just the right intervention, a very detailed map of the reality on the ground. Now, of course, if you're familiar with these kind of concepts, we can't make models that are one-to-one because they're too complex to even use effectively. It would defeat the purpose if you're making the model. And they confuse the map for the territory, as the common expression goes. There's infinite ways that humans can understand concepts, and a one-to-one map would have ceased to have any pointed meaning in the first place. So they needed to analyze this complex situation and come up with a pointed model, which they did not do in this kind of a case? So to rephrase those 3 points, we're looking at the what in this case is the fidelity, the level of fidelity to a human's understanding of the reality in terms of the snakes. And the why is going to be about the meaning, right? Which in this case I'm talking about in serious games or learning games. There's often talking about the attitudes, the skills, the knowledge, etc. So, but why these values? Why these attitudes are important for you? And then the how is the model engaging? How are we engaging with the models, the whats and the whys of that model? So that's all the game design part up top, how you make it engaging, how the model represents things, what are the dynamics that are happening during play. The why is why you chose those hows and those whats in the first place. So sitting above all of these things, to get meta and oversimplistic, we're going to talk about the complex values, or the why, right? These kind of simplistic things. Why, the why of this. So I'm going to give you another example here that's going to serve as a more game style example. So this is a classic version of what I often see as like learning games. And if anybody's ever worked in learning games or educational games, you'll see this tragic kind of thing in the first place. And apologies to the creators of this, but I'm going to tear it apart. So here we go. So this tragic example is this ethical dilemmas board game that they wanted to have in order to train these trainers about what to do in the right situation, as you might imagine. All right, this is what it looked like. Granted, of course, this is just like a workshop version, but this was the game. It was billed as an interactive platform to bring in the views and ideas of participants in a constructive method in order to develop ethical decision-making skills and apply sound judgments regarding how those ethical dilemmas can be practically resolved or mitigated. So how do you play this thing? It's probably pretty clear by looking at the board how this is played, right? Roll some dice, land on a space, maybe land on one with a question mark. You get a little question, answer the question, you're right or you're wrong. Interesting, ethical dilemmas where you're right or wrong. So if we broke this down, and really if I had to reflect on this, I'd say that that top bullet point there on the left is actually part of the how as well. But their goal, or why they were doing this, is they wanted to develop ethical decision-making skills. This was important to them, and apply the sound judgments, as I said. They decided, well, what we're going to do is we're going to make this interactive platform. And this interactive platform is the board game. You're going to be roll the dice, land on the spaces, select a multiple choice response in line with the fundamental principles of the their code of ethics. All right. This brings up, of course, a lot of questions. How are they actually analyzing the problem in this example? Why are they rolling dice and moving? Why is that even relevant? Or why are they only sometimes asking questions as opposed to every space they land on? Why is this? How do we know that the resolution that they've chosen is a more practical one? Like, none of these are addressed in it, and they've really simplified the model to just, do you memorize the manual on ethical decision making? Right? It's kind of a not useful exercise. So what we end up with is a situation where, and excuse me for the typo in here, that middle one should say wrong model, wrong reality, basically in the middle one. So we've got the wrong meaning, right? There was a kind of a vague purpose or misaligned outcomes in a game. The wrong reality is basically they've kind of focused on the wrong part of the reality. The fidelity's wrong, too high, way too abstract, or they're really lost in the details. In this case, they were just focused on the handbook and not on the ethical decision making. And they were misaligned to the meaning of making better ethical decision making. And the model they had was not engaging them in that very well either. So a design challenge I typically come across is, how do we find the meaning and model that are important and identify what states in the game, for instance, or in the simulation or in this model are to be avoided? And then find what are the value-laden skills, like the why those skills that align with the model that they want in the first place. So put another way, being lost in the clouds, they're way too abstract, can lead to the wrong model. So way too abstract, we have snakes, kill snakes, good, right? Wrong model, that can lead to being lost in the weeds. So in this case, they might say, it didn't work, we just need more rules. We'll just add a rule that makes it illegal to breed snakes. And it's just gonna get more complex, but it didn't actually address why the model was wrong in the first place. So, and they're gonna get lost in these weeds trying to fix something that was completely the wrong fidelity. So in their case, they're like, well, we value human life. There's too many snakes biting people. We should kill the snakes. How do we do that? Pay people to kill the snakes. Next step, profit. Right. So we want to know, what are the values in play? Why are they doing this? Before we even get into the design of anything. Classical scoping exercises, you might say. And so what I'm looking at is a technique that I've used to draw these out, which I find quite effective. in a Q&A afterwards. I'd love to hear any more models that you use or techniques that you use to draw these kind of things out. I'm going to start with here 1 and 2, why these values. So why should we value the objectives that are there, the meaning that's there? If you think of other kind of board games or digital games that are just rife with assumptions and biases that we aren't go unanalyzed because they're for entertainment purposes, I can think of a number of board games that just treat like Australia as terra nullius, right? There's nobody there, you're just colonizing, etc. A lot of people these days say, well, we recognize that's bad, but we don't know how to represent the people who are there, so they just kind of ignore it, right, still. So at least people are recognizing that there are values that they're encoding into the games that they're making. And that's kind of the objective here, is how do we know what we're encoding into our games that we make? So we'll start here. Why is addressing this problem important? Why does this game need to be made? So, okay, here's the method, the bulk of this. You won't be able to read those, but I can share these slides afterwards, those little references at the bottom. So basics of this come down to, and this is where I'm going to get heady and theoretical, and I'm going to bring it back down to the practical technique, is that constructive meaning that we have and learning goes back way to Plato's distinction of like teaching versus talking, and continues throughout educational philosophy today as a key indication that if you want to make new meanings, you must expose yourself to new experiences, which can be talking about it, but often the experiences themselves. And then you need to relate it to your held schema of the world, these predictive models that we hold in our head, and then change your mind and feelings towards it. So the cognitive knowledge itself has a low permeation into how we feel about our constructs. But it is the feelings themselves that dominate most of the approaches and applications of that knowledge into the world. So this is recognized today with more modern psychologists like Daniel Kahneman, classic psychologist economist, who talked about fast brain, system 1, system 2 thinking, and it's that system fast thinking, the emotional part, that leads to a lot of the decision making we make. Jonathan Haidt, elephant and the rider kind of metaphor stuff as well, the elephant being our emotions, the rider being the rational part of our brain. And basically this led into the entire field of construct psychology in the 1940s, the idea that if we can bring out these constructs in our mind, what we're describing things, we can instead eventually actually change how we feel about them by analyzing in that rational way the mental constructs we have. So a ladder. A ladder that's often used in design work as well to abstract things and bring things down into the concrete as well. Here's what it is if you're not familiar. So if just the language side of this, if you think of a cow, something that's, you could all picture a cow in your mind, we're gonna start right in the middle there. Cow, nice physical creature. We might have a different cow in our mind, but we have one. And if I ask then to, well, what is a cow? You might go up this ladder and say, well, cow is just livestock. That's what a cow is. And more abstract than that, it's an asset to our farm, our corporate farm, which basically means a cow is wealth. So in some way, the person whose constructs kind of lead up towards there is thinking of cow as just a thing. That might be quite different from someone else who's looking at a cow. Based on their context, based on their lived experience, et cetera. If we go down from cow, Bessie, it might be the particular name for this cow, we might get to a particular thing, and I'm not too concerned with this a lot at the moment, but basically these nameable assemblages of atoms, right? It gets to this almost too lost in the weeds abstraction, too concrete if we start talking about the cow as like, well, you know, the cow is molecules and it's just atoms and we're all connected, which is really a nice philosophical stance to take, but also not functional for the cow, right? So we need to say what's the right level of abstraction to aim our game at and to talk about. So we need to unpack that. I'm going to use an example that I did this with a couple of years ago. I made a board game for an energy company, which will go nameless. And they had a new supply chain that they wanted to make. And so, well, their simple goal was get people to understand the chain, the new supply chain, and the roles that are involved. Okay, great. Why? That was the big question. They had an idea of doing a trivia game. And of course, that was not going to be a goer. So we said, well, why is that? If pirates are coming and taking your oil tankers or what have you, how do you respond? Is there a right choice for that? So we had to analyze this using the abstraction ladder. So this is what it's going to look like. I'm going to run you through how this works, or how it worked in this particular case. Your mileage may vary. It's not the tool for every job. And there's some caveats in using it as well. So here we go. So their problem at the beginning was we would like to understand the supply chain's component parts and the roles involved. Simple enough. So the first part of this is acting like a 3-year-old and just asking why for everything. So you say, okay, what do you want? You want this. All right. Why is that important? And I don't mean to do it in a skeptical way. When I'm talking to them, I'm not like, okay, why is that important? I mean, very, very much in a way where I want to understand them. I say, well, okay, why is it important for you to understand this? And there's a number of different prompts that you can use, and I'll be able to share those later on a QR code. So they might say something like, well, we want to be able to, our people to be able to anticipate the demand, the fuel demand, and the problems that might come up. Okay, cool. Now, this is a critical part that comes from the construct, personal construct psychology, is that when we have these constructs in our mind, like livestock, it's not isolated. There's a dipole to it. So what is livestock opposed to that you are considering maybe a lesser than? It's not necessarily that you value one more than the other, but you've got to figure out which one you do value more. So in this case, it's clear that they wanted to value the anticipation of demand and problem. So then you can ask something like, well, as opposed to what? What would the opposite of this look like? Sometimes it's painfully obvious. Sometimes it's revealing. In this case, they said things like, well, we don't want to be unprepared for situations, right? We want to be able to anticipate demand and problems, so we're not unprepared. Okay, cool. So then I can say, well, why is it important to not be unprepared? Or why is it important then to be able to anticipate these, right? Or in this case, it was better to ask, why is it important to not be unprepared? Right? I said, well, because we want to be able to have an effective supply chain, right? So it's important to be able to anticipate demand because they can have an effective chain as opposed to an error-prone chain, right? So they were supplying all of these information. Now, you might quickly realize that if you've ever done some design facilitation work, you're going to get, if you have more than one person in the room, or even if you have one person, you're going to get a lot of different answers for this. So the ladder often ends up more looking like a web, and you can go off in different ladders, but it's your job then to kind of group these things back up and say, okay, where are there similarities here so that you can kind of get some cohesion around what the values are. And ideally, of course, you're not working with people who are so detached from the problem that they don't represent the people playing the game. Hopefully they are the people playing the game in the end. So why is it important to not be error prone? Because it'll increase trust, right? If we don't make errors and we have an effective chain, we'll build trust with our company. It's bad if to lose that, as opposed to, of course, having lots of accidents and being unreliable. And if we continue up, why is it important to have a lot of trust and be viewed, not have accidents? Is because, money, right? It's a company. So in the end, they wanted some dollar dues. And it comes down to that. And we could say, okay, basically now we're way too abstract. We can stop. The goal here is then to say, what's the highest level of abstraction that's the most useful for them to action? That is in line with what they want. So they can kind of help pick this out. And in this case, it really was that increasing trust part. Like that's the tool that they can do, and having the effective chain was the way to get that trust. So if we remember what those values are that are in play, they said, well, we need a system of something to interact with or ways to think about our supply chain that allow us to increase trust from our customers and from the public. So what we're going to do is then replace the thing in the middle and then step down the ladder into the functional parts of this and find out what some of the operational and concrete barriers were that they were coming across in their real life, so that when we're building the model, we can simulate that. Now, granted, I am talking about this as if it was a simulation, and these models, this kind of technique does work anytime you're making a game, even if it's not a direct simulation of something as well. It's just talking about the values inside. So we take that understand in the middle, and we can replace it with something like, how might we, this is where we're going to start now, how might we increase trust in our company? Because that's the thing that they said they wanted to value the most. They say, well, they'll brainstorm a bit, they'll come back, and they say something like, well, how could we do that? Well, we could be safe and reliable. That's how we do it. Be safe and reliable. Very generic at this point still. They haven't really drilled into how you can be safe and reliable. So we can start asking questions, and again, going with that dipole. In this case, it's practical and functional. So the language around it's going to be things like what's stopping you, what's in the way, or what's making it hard to do that. And they might say something like, oh, well, it's hard to be safe and reliable because people are rushing. There's a lot of cost involved. People in the chain don't see how their decisions impact the other parts. Classical silos thing. So I would say, well, how might you do that? How might you overcome that boundary? They'll say something like, well, if people could just communicate over their shared goals, like they would understand how their parts impacted. This is classic kind of people sitting in a room saying, we need to de-silo our workers, right? This is what it's getting down to. They need to communicate over the shared goals, safety and delivery. What's stopping you from doing that? They say, well, people don't do it because of the pressures on their particular role. It's difficult for them to find the time to talk about their role with each other and learn about how it's important. So how might you overcome that? Well, if we took perspectives of the other roles, maybe that's how we could do it. I just want you, person who works in the dock, to understand me, who is ordering the shipping, et cetera, et cetera. That's what I want. So what's stopping you from doing that? Well, my role is really complicated. I can't break it down into like one thing and say, you can remember this. It's like, that's fair enough. So how might you do that? And well, if I could simplify the role, then I could have someone adopt it, right? If I could simplify it. So at this point, we could just get down into like the real problem seems to be they need to be able to collaborate and talk about their roles really well with each other. Okay, they seem to be focusing on that. So we can kind of stop at that point and say, we're going to be having a game where you're going to be taking each other's roles, right? It's pretty clear at this point in the design where it might lead. So in the end, you end up with something like this. And now again, this is going to web out if you have lots of people, lots of different hows, and you can group them up and get even more information. But the general process is the same, particularly if you have groups working in parallel to kind of generate these things. And once you have this, and granted, I've simplified this from the reality, of course, right? There's just got one ladder. Once you've got this, you're going to be able to translate that into a high-level game design document. You work with them, and I'll show you what that's going to look like using a very simple matrix that I'm going to do. So the basic here is we end up with a values that's going to lead to the goals of the game, increasing trust, and we're going to be able to generate the game summary. That QR code there is another way of asking these questions about the game design model, not the laddering part, but what you might do afterwards. And it's about getting to know the system involved and who's got control, what are the agents, what kind of variables are in play, that kind of a thing. So it's a very simple, high-level document, but you might find it useful. So if you want that, and it's what that next step is going to be. Right, so what you can do is then rephrase their value and goal and game in these kind of statements. And then like what the game, the how part. So the values, we want to increase trust in our company. There's our values. But problem, people in the chain don't see how their decisions impact the other parts, causing us to be less effective, trying to pull in the words from the values that they were talking about. Therefore, the how, the model that we're going to be making, the game needs to simply model the roles. And simply here, I don't mean just it's easy to do it. I mean simply is like it needs to model them in a simple way so that others can experience the decisions when cooperatively, shared goals, recognizing that they had shared goals, another value they noted, running the supply chain safely and reliably. So how now? We're not going to do this ourselves. I've run this a few times in workshops where we have people do a simulation. And this is where I want to know where some problems come up, right? The first is when you're running this kind of a thing, you need to make sure you're dealing with the audience who is playing the game or the ones who are engaging, basically the end users, right? Because if you try doing this from a different perspective, you get the different perspectives values. I ran this as an example once in a workshop where a simple thing, you're playing the role of a parent, you're trying to get your kid to water the plants on the right schedule and with the right amount of water, and you're saying, oh, how do we do this? So they unpacked their values, and then they said, well, we're going to make this little game or these little techniques that we can use for parenting to get our child to do this thing. The language I'm using now, even talking about it, shows how paternal and directional it was. They tried to gamify it with all these kind of rewards and things because they were talking about, well, it's important to be responsible for watering these plants. They're talking like a parent would to the child. Their values in the plants were completely opposite of what the child's might have been. So it's really important to work with the right groups of people when doing these value mapping. Otherwise, you end up with a very skewed perspective, and you end up with a lot of learning games that are very, made by the corporate heads, not the people who are going to be playing them. So. Some tips. First of all, repeatedly asking why can feel really silly. So explain why you're doing laddering in the first place. Steep it in some of the theory. If you're going to use this kind of a technique, don't just say, time to ladder. Why? It's going to turn some heads. It's also sometimes really difficult to answer why or to get that opposite as opposed to. You can skip it, right? Don't force those answers. Just go with that flow. recording it can get really messy. As I said, it's often going to be a web of some kind. So make sure you've got a lot of room on a digital whiteboard or a real whiteboard to do this, and keep things organized as you go or afterwards. So it works best also finally with real experiences, because you're talking about embodied things and the constructs they have around these experiences that are not just semantic. So it's good for that. So what fidelity is relevant here? So this is where we're going to start getting into the what kind of game to make. What should the model be showing? So what observations do we want to make, et cetera. So I'm going to quickly show you this activity goal alignment chart. There's a tool there at that link that Josh Whitkin made. This is his PhD thesis in like a decade or so ago, where he looked at a lot of learning games and he showed that a lot of the ones that were bad, it was because they simply had really bad alignment between what the goals of the game were and the activity that players were doing and what they were supposed to be getting out of it. So whitkin.com/AGA for activity goal alignment. So what does this mean basically? So we're going to be aiming at things in the lower right-hand quadrant of this. Some quick examples: low activity goal alignment and low order thinking. This would be things like digital worksheets, so like all those kind of quiz games you might see, Math Blasters. A particularly bad one, I think, is Prodigy, which kids play a lot in schools these days, where you get a math problem every few minutes, and it's just like drilling the language of math problem, but most of the time you're basically playing Pokemon. And so you're doing a worksheet, colorful worksheets. Low order thinking. Higher order thinking is the complex things that happen in a classroom anyway, but then you're just kind of putting points on top of it. This is very low activity goal alignment because there's a lot of stuff going on in the classroom, but the points you're getting really don't align very well with the actual activities that you're doing. It's just like, good job, sticker. Oh, there it is. On the top right, you have high activity goal alignment, low order thinking, because you're just you're simulating tasks, physical tasks. These are like flight simulators. Actually a quite complicated thing to do, but there's a best practice. You can drill, get up into your skills. Also games that are about, I've seen training games for people who are working at fast food or grocery checkouts, right? And I've made some of those. And oftentimes what you're doing is not dealing with complex spaces. There's a best practice and you're upskilling in best practice. We're looking at games right now that are like, it's complex and we want to do the complex thing. That's where we're going to be at. These are a lot of simulation games where you end up with role play involved, or in this case, a board game. So what are we looking at? We're looking at the alignment of these things, real world outcomes to the dynamics that players are having within the game and the behaviors that they're going to be doing that align with those game goals. Pretty standard stuff. I'm just going to use a little matrix to show inside the game, outside the game. And as a result, you might be able to have something you can pull into a game design. So here it is. This is what I've got. At the very top, I've got the why. In the middle, the observable success. So what does victory look like in this game? And perhaps what does it lead to outside of it? And what kind of behaviors are going to be going on? And I'm not just talking about an individual player who's going to be engaging in one behavior. Here's a cookie for doing that behavior. But I mean, what are the interactions between these players, those kind of behaviors? How do I want them relating? So I pulled that right in from the chart for the laddering technique. Basically, outside of the game, we want them to increase trust in our company, right? That's an ultimate goal. And I'm not trying to say that playing a game is going to suddenly magically give them increased trust in their company. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying that there's a real world objective in the long run, a complex space where trust in the company is something that they want to raise, right? And in the game, all we want to do is simply model that. And it's not a linear cause and effect here in terms of victory. I'm really critical of a lot of games that look at like medical interventions and say they're just going to play this game and your problems will be solved. It doesn't work that way, right? It's a discussion tool, a facilitation tool, right? So this game simply needs to, as a model the others' experiences and decisions, right? So what is an observable success going to look like in the real world and kind of in the game here? Pull it in from the chart. It's to increase trust, be safe and reliable, have an effective chain. Conveniently, when I remade that ladder, I used the words I could pull right into this diagram. But yeah, that's basically how it works. You just pull in the values and say, well, you want increased trust. That's the goal you want. So in the game, we need to be able to show how trust is going up, how you can be safe and reliable. That's what an effective chain looks like. And so, okay, maybe we'll do something quite reductive and say you get points for staying safe, right? Or delivering on time and at location, or efficient costs of a chain. We didn't just give them points for being safe, by the way. it's a little more complicated than that. But the idea is saying, what do you score? How do you know victory is achieved? Is related to these values. The QR code that I supplied a couple slides back is the first tool you might use to figure out what does an effective chain look like? What is the chain? Right, that kind of a thing. Those are different conversations to have with the clients. The behaviors that they wanted were things like anticipation of problem and demand, taking perspectives of other roles, communicating over shared strategies, verby things. Yeah, these are the skills then that they actually can practice, and not in a way where it says you'll just get better at doing this, but these are the skills that are analogous to things that problem solve, right? In a way that you might do with cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Or any kind of ideas of like, if we can just break out those constructs and talk about them, it's a first step to being able to kind of change how we feel about some of the things that lie underneath of them. So in this game, skipping the step where we analyze what the actual supply chain was, we say, whoa, this is going to be a game where you're going to be playing cooperatively. The players are going to have roles that reflect their real life roles. They're going to be sharing the managed supply chain to respond to the demand and events that are going to be cropping up in the game. And problems are going to be created by the players and by the system. This is in stark contrast to the ethical decision-making game that I mentioned, because this is a game where the players are just managing a supply chain. The problems are emergent from how they've decided to do this, spiced up with events like pirates or bad weather, or like fuel has gone bad on the boat and didn't pass safety testings and things like that. The question of how they respond to it then is going to be based off of the current game state, right? As you would hope. So if you're looking at just saying, hey, what are the games? The strategies that you can do in the game are going to be linked to the kind of goals that you've got, and the actual activities you're going to be doing in the game are related to the dynamics that you want down there. So as I said, your mileage may vary, your methods may vary, and actually going about that part of this. Here's some examples that I can recommend to you. Try out at Game Design is a book you can get. It comes with some worksheets and workshops you can do. The activity theory-based model for serious game design. Yeah, it's fine. It's fine, et cetera, right? All of these are going to be outside the scope of the presentation, but it's something you may want to look up if you want to dive into this realm of making games for other people, which is largely how I end up making games. So again, I can share these slides if anybody comes up to me later. Right. So the prototype for this game, this was an early digital prototype of the game where we knew we had a map of New Zealand. So I'm just going to show how some of this kind of eventuated in this prototype. We had all these roles that are on the left. Players are taking roles. They were playing this tournament style with people in the company across New Zealand. And by tournament style, I mean they would play a group of four-ish against another group of four, against another group of four, against another group of four, asynchronous, and they were trying to go for a high score. And the high score, we did this because then I could take the deck of events that are random events and queue them up so that they were getting them in the same order. That way they said, well, how are we going to respond to these events in the same, in whatever way they chose. That was the randomness of the game, right? It was those events, and they all had the same randomness, bit of a cheat. So what's not shown here is how they mapped kind of their sprints that they would do, which were how turns were structured and the like. We tried to use a lot of the language that they wanted, and they could track the actions that they were taking, of which they only had 4, and each one dealt with a different part of the supply chain, from ordering and sourcing the fuel, which was reduced down because we didn't actually care about the price of the fuel. In this game, fuel didn't matter. The price of anything didn't matter. It was just a slight efficiency point bonus you could get at the end. But really, top thing was safety, which was in this game ended up being basically your multiplier, like huge multiplier of points at the end of the game. And if you ever had a safety violation or an accident, you're going to be in a totally different tier of points at this point. All right, so it was very, very bad to have accidents in this game. And you're increasing trust in terms of just getting things there and on time. That's how you earned points, at the right time. And the dynamics here, really, that's the important part. You had players who were playing different roles with their powers, right? Kind of very simple light strategy kind of a game thing. But they had to work out the timing quite specifically based on some of the rules that were in the game, which I won't get into. So they needed to talk about them, and not only talk about them, but the game was stopped halfway through, played in 2 rounds, to where they're then talking about the abstraction itself. This is a key thing, is you've got to take these games and kind of bring them back up into the context In this case, they're saying, well, this model is totally crap, and here's why it's crap. My role does a lot more than this, et cetera. Getting them talking about how the model is wrong. They're the ones who know the complexity. We shouldn't be trying to assume it and say, well, here's our model, just go with the model, it's great. No, 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 no. Always, always let the people who are locally and in the context frame their own complexity. So in this case, the roadmaster or the person who deals with the logistics on shipping on the ground is going to be able to say, this happens, but actually it's a lot more than this, and here's how, right? And they can start that conversation. And that's really what we want out of the game, was these people who work across the company having the conversations with themselves, and this is a facilitation tool for doing that. And more stuff. All right, so a couple conclusions. Here is this. Keep the higher why, the whys in mind, and then you can hone the fidelity of your model to the right things, the things that align with their values. The laddering thing is a technique that I've used successfully to draw out the mental constructs that you can use to plan the game. And then there's a lot of ways to go about going it from there. Action mapping or a games-based learning canvas can help that out. That QR code goes to a version of a games-based learning canvas that I made about 7 years ago. It's useful. I find it's difficult to use if you don't know. It's better to use as an analysis tool of a game too. If you want to use it as planning, it takes a bit of practice. So I'm happy to walk people through that as well if they want to. But just scan that, give me a contact if you like it. How are we doing on time? Plenty of time, eh? Plenty of time. Cool. All right, about 20 minutes or so. So 15 minutes. So that's perfect time for questions. I do have all of these other slides that I'm not going to go into about what is action mapping, et cetera. Right? But just to show you what the action mapping or the canvas would look like, action mapping is a way, it's usually used in learning design. So any learning designers in the room, yeah, you know what this is. Kathy Moore developed this technique, or at least popularized this technique. I'm sure a lot of people are doing it before her, to be honest. It's pretty straightforward. You basically are saying, well, what is the goals that you want that are measurable, and then what are the activities that you use that get you there? Those are those green kind of, what do we want to call them? Green triangles. And then there's kind of the blue circles with the eyes, like what are the information you need to know in order to do those activities, right? So if you're using this for this kind of a game activity, you're saying what are the players trying to do, what makes it challenging, et cetera. So in the middle there is what's a game goal. And then those job behaviors are the game goals. So the middle part is the aligned goal. The green parts are what are the game goals that progress towards it, or that represent those values. And then the hands are what are the game challenges then that reflect or that enact those values, those game goals. And then finally, what are the resources and decisions you're making in the game, right? It takes a bit of practice to kind of change action mapping over to this, but basically saying, what do we have to make in our games? Is it time? Is that the resource we're using? Is it oil? What is it? And then the game challenges are what are the tasks? Well, I got to get it there on time. And how's the game goal? Well, I get it there on time and increased trust and by the customer, whatever. And then in the end, it's about avoiding accidents, really. I mean, all of this is done safely on purpose. So this is what the canvas looks like that I was talking about, and I'll give you the QR code. So you can see it kind of goes in this clockwise fashion, starting in the lower left. What is the whole context of this learning? And then you kind of work your way up, looking at what are the goals that we've got with the game and learning some basic play experience types that can kind of say what might emphasize this into the fabric of the game. The fabric here I'm using as a twee way of talking about what's the medium, right? So how are you, what's the instance of this game? How long is it going to be played over? What materials are going to be used? Is it digital? Is it physical? Et cetera, and going through to the game designy side, which I'm not going to talk about the game designy side, about who are you? What are you trying to do, et cetera. So that is me for that. And I'd really like to open it up to any kind of questions you might have for the next 10 minutes or so about this and what kind of models you might have used that are effective, because I always want to learn more facilitation techniques and more things to draw out what really matters to people. Thank you. You got the roving microphone? Okay. Any questions?
You were talking a bit before about potential for, oh, cheers. Hello. Oh, this is quite loud. So one of the things you were mentioning before was trying to keep the values in line with, say, for example, you have someone that's on the team and their values don't actually align with what the company's trying to achieve. How do you navigate that situation?
Yeah, good. That's a tough one. In the particular example you're talking about, where a person in the company's values don't align with the company, it's unavoidable, really. Companies don't exist. They're just these amalgamations of like things trying to make money in the end, right? So a lot of people have a lot of different values in the company. The question is about who you're getting in the room. And if your goal is to say, and this, when you're talking with stakeholders, in this case, generic, who's hiring you, you can say, okay, who is this going to affect the most or impact the most? Who is it actually for? Then talk to those people, right? It doesn't matter where they are in the company. If the game is for, or outside the company, usually they're the customers and that kind of thing. So finding that right audience is the key thing. And there's no tried and true way that I've found of saying, how do I get the right people in the room? I do know that if you've got different people in the room with different values that I've identified, that's an internal problem with the organization as well. They have not figured out what they are about. And that's fine. That's a whole different exercise too, that you might be able to use a laddering technique to do. And in fact, I have just recently had a conversation where we used the laddering technique and they had never asked these kind of questions before. They had some vague ideas of what their values were. Again, won't name the company or the organization. This was a nonprofit. And they found this quite a useful exercise just to figure out what their values were. But these were just two people in the organization, right? Do they represent all of that organization? Probably not, right? So it's about choosing the right team at that point, and that team should be the people on the ground who are going to be affected by this. And ideally, if we're in the magic world, you would use a tool like SenseMaker or some kind of large organizational information gathering tool that is very narrative based, and you'd be gathering lots of information from lots of people who are impacted. And that's the best way to address a complex situation. Otherwise, you can't. Right? You just got to say who's got the best inside knowledge of why this company ticks or why this organization does what it does. Yeah, so picking a team, it's a hard one. Yeah, you're right.
Cool. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to go back to like an earlier example of something you brought up with just about highlighting. Well, I think you were saying like highlighting how sometimes these models can go completely askew.
Yeah.
But with the snakes thing, how, as I said, we value human life. There's too many snakes biting people. We kill all the snakes. There is actually, I just wanted to, well, I don't know, you may know about it already, but I wanted to get your thoughts on, someone tried that actually. I think it was in America or something, but like they put a bounty on snakes. So you could bring dead snakes in and they'd pay you for it. So what happened was people started breeding snakes in their garage and bringing in buckets of dead snakes. And they repealed the law, they released all the snakes, and now there's more snakes than there was, and people are still getting bitten. It's a complete failure. They went in the other direction.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly what happened in Delhi as well. Like the funny thing about that exact example of perverse incentives with the Cobra effect has happened so many times, right? Raccoons, I think it's happened with as well. Like it's just we keep repeating those mistakes. Oh, where did I go back? Yeah, it's whacking. It's like Springfield, Illinois, like whacking day, right? From The Simpsons. It's let's kill all the snakes. Here's the day we kill the snakes. They weren't trying to emphasize Cobra effect, but yeah. Really, all of that example of perverse incentives is talking about something which I like to talk about in other contexts more, which is applied complexity, and the idea that when you're taking any kind of really complex system, and complex here I mean things where the relationships between things are unknown and ever changing, right, over time. So you can never know them at one point in time, and people just kind of feel for them if they're in the system. If you try to make that legible to people who are to communicate it, you inevitably reduce it to something that's going to create perverse incentives eventually. One of my favorite examples is early Prussia in like 17th century or so, when they made scientific forestry. And the idea there was like, oh, we want to know how much lumber we're getting out of our forests, to the Prussian government. And then they get the ministers to go there and they decide there's too many trees. Why don't we just plant spruce trees in lines, right? Finally, they came up with this. And you can imagine what happens. Lumber production goes way up. They did great. About 80 years later, 2 or 3 tree generations, forest death, right? They started reducing their forest production of lumber, the thing they only cared about, not to mention the impact on the local ecology, et cetera, or the people who used the forest, right? So they completely destroyed the ecosystem for the one metric that they cared about, which is a problem whenever we try to reduce something to a model. It's inevitable in order to communicate it. It's just a matter of picking the right model for the right time and then discarding it. Yeah. Just a couple more minutes, I think we've got. So one more question.
Yeah. So 2 things. First, there's a resource called Seeing Like a State that I might. Yep.
Yeah, James Scott's book, which includes the anecdote.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great book. At least the first 2 chapters. Yeah.
Really useful for like, oversimplifying a model, because if you don't oversimplify it, you can't use it. But I was wondering, so this allows you to take a real world situation, break it down to its values, then build a game out of it. How useful do you believe this would be as a tool for taking a game, extracting the values from the behaviors that it's incentivizing, and then sort of figuring out the behavior set that it's encouraging in the players? Like, can you take this ladder and run it backwards?
I never have, but I'm really interested in doing that now. Also, to reframe what you're talking about just a little bit as well, because I think it's, if we're taking a situation and breaking it down into the values, I want to reframe that, and I think is more what you meant anyway, is we're taking a particular people's values in a situation and analyzing that, because situations don't have values, right? Yeah. So
sorry.
We're talking about the people who are involved, and I'd really be interested to see how a game, what kind of behaviors and activities the games encourage. I don't know if I'd be able to get it to the values simply because I wouldn't know who's talking about it, right? So it's gonna be more of like, how do I value the things that are in the game if I'm doing the analysis? That'd be my guess if I tried to do it, but I think it'd be a really useful exercise to talk about a game experience.
Within a company, possibly as a post-mortem tool, like given a game is done, possibly running it through this and figuring out what we were making. Yeah,
that'd be quite interesting, just for companies, game companies' values, yeah. Cool.
Hi. Earlier you talked about breaking down all the different roles inside the company into the more basic tasks and stuff to implement the game. And when you designed it, is that a step that you also got the individual employees, the individuals, to help design that, or did you just kind of take data and then make that on your own in a vacuum because you didn't want their biases, if they considered their role more important than others or something, if that could have indirectly influenced how you were making the game if you centered it around the wrong thing?
Yeah, so do you mean something around this area of the slide where I'm saying, well, what we did was take the perspectives of their roles, and we said one of the ways we're going to do this is create roles in the game. When we did this, there was a variety of people that I was able to speak with personally who had the different roles in the company. So they were the ones who had the intimate knowledge of that, because they're kind of the hands-on managers of the different things. So they did the role, but they're also the one in charge of that department. Also, the level of abstraction I needed for this kind of activity, which was very discursive about the roles and allowing the space for them to talk about it with the other people, means I didn't need to get into the hard data of anything and kind of pull something out magically myself. Instead, I just relied on the people who were in that context to tell me, basically, what's this role do in relation to the others? Done, right? Because at that point, the abstraction I was making was part of the talking point, right? So that they could elaborate on it. Yeah, the benefit of that was not of the abstraction to the right level was I didn't need to get into the data, because there's no way I could represent all of the data honestly. And then if I did, I'd basically fooling myself, wouldn't I? Because it's like, it's not going to be right ever. It just has a greater, like a lot of AI these days, a greater simulation of the reality that convinces us that it's a human thoughts.
Thanks.
I think we're good.
Cool. That's all for our time today. Thank you so much for coming out this early on a Saturday morning to hear about a really specific and esoteric subject. I appreciate your time. So thank you.